All right, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panel. My name is John Ippolito. This is Right Click to Preserve, Preservation, NFTs, and Distributed Ledgers. We are three professionals working in the field, and we're going to talk about the promises and perils of the blockchain as an archival tool for preserving, in this case, digital art. And I want to start, actually, if you go to the next slide, John, by talking about, of course, what a blockchain is, which is that it is a distributed ledger of essentially databases across different computers on the internet that are cryptographically verified so that they are always in sync. And that's a fairly secure, if not a new way of creating an archival system of sorts. But as you'll see, its archival status has been somewhat overblown, and we'll talk about what to do about that and how to preserve the works that are inextricably linked to the blockchain. So first, what this panel isn't about is not about the aesthetic value of NFTs, like whether monkey JPEGs are as good as the Mona Lisa. It's not about the economic impact of NFTs. NFTs, of course, being the use of the blockchain tokens to sell digital art by selling a cryptographic hash, essentially, on a blockchain. We're not going to talk about whether NFTs promise to sort of break the traditional hierarchies of the art world have actually functioned. And we're not going to talk about the environmental impact of blockchains. It's an important topic, just we don't have time in this panel. What we will talk about, or I should say also, next slide, John. We're also going to make some assumptions. Some of these you may have heard. We think they're myths. So NFT standards typically involve storing art assets on the blockchain. No, actually they don't. With a few exceptions, the digital media, that is an image, a sonic file, a video file, are actually out on the internet. And what's stored on the blockchain is a cryptographic token that points indirectly to essentially the web location of that asset. So a common misperception. The second one, NFT contracts typically transfer rights to media. No, they don't do that either. Again, with rare exceptions, the copyright does not transfer when a collector buys the NFT of a JPEG or an MPEG-4. Those rights actually stay with whoever created them. And instead, all they own is this essentially token on the blockchain, with some exceptions. A third myth, NFTs help establish clear, verifiable provenance, something of very great interest to curators and historians and archivists. Where was a work first offered? Who did it get sold to? When did it change hands? That's all really important for certain parts of art history. Unfortunately, the claims that crypto crusaders make for blockchain being the ultimate guide to provenance are pretty don't really stand up in the real world, because in the real world, the digital wallets that by which people exchange cryptocurrencies and purchase NFTs are pseudonymous. So it's not easy to tell who is buying a certain work except from that pseudonym. Also, the platforms that trade NFTs tend to obscure that information. So number three, unfortunately, I think is also a myth. Finally, adding art to a blockchain preserves it for the future. Most of the archivists in the audience probably knew that might be questionable. We're going to look specifically at why that might not be true in this panel. But we are going to assume there are some truths to the way that artists are working with the blockchain. First, some creators are registering technically and conceptually rigorous artwork, and that's worth preserving. So these are people who work with the blockchain, and even if the blockchain dies, we think their work is worthy of interest and innovative enough for art history. Secondly, there are no official standards for conserving artwork that includes distributed ledgers. I've never seen one. The rest of us haven't seen one. So we're going to try to break that impasse and suggest that we might be able to find strategies that work. Next slide. So we're going to break this panel into three parts. Regina Harsanyi will talk about medium-specific preservation issues by focusing on a set of case studies that we've looked at of artists who are trailblazers in the field and have, in fact, made work that depend on the blockchain as opposed to work that just is pointed to by the blockchain. In the second part, I'll talk about some medium-independent preservation issues using the variable media paradigm as a way of thinking beyond blockchain. Can the works exist outside of a blockchain? And last, one of the solutions that I'll talk about, number two, John's going to go into more depth, and that is emulation as a potential solution. And I think that Regina's next. Take it away, Regina.
Thank you, John. To start, I often hear that non-fungible tokens are simply receipts and that they have little bearing on the preservation of the often off-chain visual and sonic assets that comprise an artwork. First of all, calling the NFT a receipt for those assets implies that you bought the visual and sonic asset to begin with, which from a legal perspective, and I don't even mean the copyright, I mean just by owning that digital or sonic asset at all, you really can't claim ownership of anything but the on-chain data. But we could get more into that in another talk. On the topic of this panel, to dismiss all artwork registered to the blockchain or dismiss learning about the underlying infrastructure of various distributed ledger protocols that have arisen since 2009 ignores the future needs of an important subset of artists that have been utilizing the components and behaviors of blockchain in the literal performative behaviors of the work. Yes, this isn't the majority, but most rigorous challenging works that consider media specificity may very well be what is acquired by museums and what is ultimately canonized over more populist, fully off-chain works registered to the blockchain, whether this is a fad or not. I have 4 of many examples to speak about high level, 2 of which we'll dive into a little deeper. In all cases, I will only have time to talk about relevant elements and will not be getting into the more literary influences or interpretations. The first example is going to show that there are artists participating in the more speculative side of the market who are also still working directly with the blockchain as an essential element of the work. This is Mad Dog Jones' Replicator on the lower left. Replicator is a work that performs a set of actions over the course of a year. The code base, which is hosted centrally on a server that Mad Dog Jones maintains, creates a set of what we call paper jams. Every time there is a jam in the code, which is designed to have 6, but somewhat unbeknown to the artist, when exactly those jams will happen over the year, the off-chain server needs to communicate with the Ethereum blockchain to mint additional NFTs that move the narrative around this copy machine that you see forward. On the lower right, we have John F. Simon Jr.'s Every Icon NFT. Some of you may be familiar with the multiple versions of Every Icon that have been produced by Simon Jr. since 1996. The artist was inspired by the promises, false or otherwise, of blockchain technology and created a version that would be fully or mostly encoded on-chain in the smart contract. So there's enough data in the smart contract itself. John enlisted the help of a team called Divergence based in London to reconstruct the artwork and the bitmap for a specific image that the primary collector was able to choose off-chain. Its existence on-chain is conceptually relevant to the work. For the 2 examples we'll discuss a bit further, both the McCoys and Rhea Myers have been contemplating the media specificity of blockchain well before the existence of NFTs, which didn't even officially come into existence until 2018, quite literally a protocol written by the creators of CryptoKitties, in which they specifically, among many things, said that art was one of the motivations for writing this protocol. Rhea was already experimenting with Ethereum protocols in 2014. That's before it even officially launched to the public in 2015. And she was also making works for other chains, including Bitcoin and derivatives at the time like Namecoin. Kevin often claims to be the first artist to mint a work on the blockchain, particularly the Namecoin derivative in 2014, although some of us have now come to understand that there were artists registering works much earlier, with evidence going back to 2013. That said, both of these artists were already approaching these chains as an emerging technology to experiment with, in my eyes no different than an artist's curiosity around any emerging technology, and not for speculation or profit motives. Next slide. So what exactly is Myers' token equal text? Rhea conceived of the token ID on-chain metadata being translatable from a string of numbers into specific English language text that you see here. The unique cryptographic hash generated upon mint would then determine the color using a translation from the first 3 bytes of data. To view this without having to manually translate this information yourself on chain, RIA did create an off-chain application, or a decentralized app, they're called dApps, that communicates with the Ethereum blockchain via a Web3 JavaScript library, fetching the state, then doing the work of turning it into an image that you see here. But you technically do not need that off-chain application. For example, you could reconstruct the English language text by taking the token ID, translating the decimals to hexadecimals, and then hexadecimals to ASCII, and you would have the same text. But there's also another aspect of the work that makes it uniquely intrinsic to the chain. The concept of this work is in part related to various smart contract protocols. In this case, the more typical non-fungible smart contract protocol and a less adopted Ethereum smart contract protocol that would act as a contract extension. The extension would allow singular group transactions of multiple smart contracts bundled together. This is particularly important for understanding the work because each of these tokens is a fragment of a larger text piece that can only come together, or is meant to come together in this niche, but dedicated dedicated Ethereum smart contract extension. Next slide. For Kevin and Jennifer McCoy's Quantum Leap from 2021, there are some parallels to the other works that I've mentioned, including Mad Dog Jones' Replicator. Visually and sonically, we know that Replicator was not on chain. It's a series of premeditated videos released after these paper jams occurred. Quantum Leap is a WebGL-based visual and has also been stored as video off-chain. It's meant to be primarily interacted with and viewed through a React application on a website that connects to the collector's digital wallet. The work also uses JavaScript in part to communicate with the Ethereum blockchain data like RIA's. And before anyone cringes too much about the WebGL and the JavaScript libraries off-chain, not to mention React, the McCoys are open to migration on this side. And to me, although not exactly a walk into the park to conserve, we have the mental and tangible toolkit collectively to handle that, unlike we do with the blockchain, as John had mentioned earlier. The JavaScript library is communicating with Ethereum via an Infura node, a reminder that most individuals interacting with the blockchain aren't actually doing so in a decentralized way, instead relying on companies that run nodes for them. Infura is owned by Consensus, the same company that also created the most popular digital wallet MetaMask, and Consensus has a majority share from JP Morgan, so down that rabbit hole. That said, the on-chain data for the work holds two key parameters that are being fetched. These are a timestamp and a set of integers that determine the current and next phase for this mandala-like primordial star, as they call it. The on-chain data will trigger the off-chain visualizer to do one of three things. It will either keep the same state, enter a transitional state called the dying star, or finally the death of a star, which you see on the right here. When a star dies, collectors have the option to trigger an on-chain rebirth, as they call it, function that shifts the timestamp and integers and also produces two additional NFTs, which don't change states but act as what Kevin McCoy calls bookmarks that refer back to this dead star visualizer and one of the other previous states of the star like you see here. Not everyone who receives a Quantum Leap work will reach the death of a star more than once, but technically you could receive the death of a star cycle up to 8 times and end up with 64 different NFTs over 3 years. Next slide. Now, before we get into preservation of the works with on-chain code and behaviors, I also want to mention that I've been doing technical artist questionnaires, manuals, advising on primary archival files, web copies, exhibition copies, README texts, checksums, and other preventive documentation that are packaged for collectors buying these works via these blockchains. And a lot of the artists need help with this now, not waiting until an archive or museum down the line shows interest in acquiring it, but when the work is still in production or within the same year if of the production wrapping up so that it's fresh in the artist's mind. Next slide. Either way, how do we begin considering preservation of an on-chain behavioral element in tandem with off-chain components, or even for works like Every Icon, at least intended to be essentially fully on-chain? One solution goes back to node operators. Most individual node operators, at least on Ethereum, not to mention the large majority run by companies like Infura have strong cryptocurrency profit motives, as we know. But one day, when a shiny new object comes about in tech, whatever that may be, node operators en masse may abandon upholding the ledger, leading to its collapse. As you see on the right here, we already have node operator fluctuation at all times. Next slide. And with the Ethereum merge to proof of stake on the horizon this week, I've gotten to know more of these core developers who are involved. Their interest is in lightening these nodes, in due time purging historical transaction history from the ledger altogether, if it's a year or older. It was never about the preservation for these core developers of these blockchains, and certainly it was not about art. For example, Ria Myers has another work, not so different aesthetically, called Is Art, where individuals can send transactions to the ledger to toggle the smart contract to either say that the smart contract is art or that it's not art. Very fitting for this talk. As validated transaction history on the ledger feels essential to understanding the work, what control do we have over its potential purging consented by the core developers who changed the actual software of the blockchain? In 2014, Ria wrote, each contract change will become a fact secured in Ethereum's blockchain with the strength of $1 million of computing power every day. This would become nullified. We are reminded that the ledger is anything but permanent, and like any software, it's bound to dramatically change over time with developer consensus, of course. A solution would be for archives and museums to form a consortium of sorts, where they each run a full node, including what currently exists as archival nodes, although that will be changing. So we may need a separate archival ledger, which I'm working with some core developers on now, that's not incentivized by the cryptocurrency, but it just is about upholding the ledger, following necessary hardware and software specifications. This is not nearly as energy intensive as mining, and as you know of this week, that's no longer even a problem necessarily. But there may be another solution beyond upholding the actual live distributed virtual machine, which John Ippolito and John Bell will discuss. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Regina. So core developers in these blockchains working hard to ensure that they last, and we can trust them only to the extent that we trust their motives, which may not be the same as an archivist's motives. And we also trust the fact that, as Regina pointed out, the blockchain is one thing, and all the systems that are built upon it are something else. And those systems can sometimes be rickety, or certainly more buffeted by market forces than the sort of technical mathematical construction of the blockchain. So as an example of one of these services, here's a prominent conditions of sale from one of the best known NFT sales of 2021, digital works that Andy Warhol had created, sold by Christie's. Rather than poke holes at the persistence of blockchain from the outside, I'll just look inside at the contract that the person signs or accepts who buys an NFT from Christie's. And that's a screenshot on the left, and I've summarized some of the problems that they highlight and take no responsibility for on the right. It can be that some of them are user error. Hey, I forgot my private or public key. Well, this is a decentralized system. There is no way to call up the bank and say, hey, I'm John, you know me, you saw me yesterday, here's my driver's license, can I get my key back? If you forget your key, that's it. And there has been at least one case I'm aware of a museum collecting NFTs that made a mistake with their wallet and lost their NFTs, very valuable NFTs as a consequence. There's also things that are the chains are vulnerable to outside attacks rather than user error. So if someone can get 51% of the nodes, essentially, they can take over the direction the chain goes and maybe use it for something it wasn't intended or change the data. That's a scenario that in some ways, in some certain sort of regimes is unlikely, but in the world of one of the sort of unintended disadvantages of switching from more carbon absorbing chains to the more sustainable proof of stake changes changes, that they're actually more susceptible to this kind of 51% attack. There's lots of other problems. You can read them on the right. So it's clear that even the people who are selling NFTs are very, have a lot of caveats about the long-term health of the blockchain. Next slide, please. So what are we going to do about that? What are we going to do if these works that are really interesting and creative and represent the surge of digital art in the last couple of years? What are we going to do if the blockchain they depend on disappears? Well, I think we can draw a lot of lessons from other examples of networked art, namely internet art, which is something that museums at a certain point really invested in, paid attention to, and some of us have spent time thinking about how to preserve. So on the left, you have another work by that same artist Regina mentions, John F. Simon Jr. This one's called Unfolding Object. It was commissioned by the Guggenheim in 2001, and it was essentially a virtual cube that each user could click on to unfold facets of that cube. And unlike a regular box where there'd be like 6 facets and be done, this one could just be unfolded kind of infinitely in any direction, like a piece of origami. And not only did it have that interactivity, but it had recordings, essentially traces of the past participants. So if you unfolded a facet that 5 people had been to, there would be 5 hash marks on that facet. And the next person who visited it, it would have 6 hash marks. And one of the fun things to do was to unfold it to the point where there are no more hash marks, and you're like, hey, I'm the first person to unfold this particular piece. So that's a work that deliberately sort of traces how it's been interacted with, and those traces are very important to the work. You can't just imagine sort of getting rid of them. So that's in some ways similar to the problem of the Ria Meyers work that Regina mentioned, where that whole sort of transaction history could be purged if the Ethereum goes a direction other than the way that it's been in the past. On the right-hand side, you see Keith Obadika's Blackness for Sale, a work of so-called auction art from the same year. So this is where artists started to think about like ownership and the fact that eBay was very popular. And so they did things like, in this case, selling someone's racial identity, obviously, and a way to sort of highlight the absurdity of that, and yet to imagine in what sense is our ethnicity and our racial identity a legal concept that could be sold. Other artists sold their body parts and so forth. Again, most of these were sort of conceptual gestures to try to provoke questions of where, at what point does consumerism and capitalism really stop, and at what point is it unstoppable. So in this case, the artist is working with the concept of ownership. What does ownership mean? Is it possible to sell your racial identity? Is it possible to sell immaterial aspects of yourself? So that sort of play with ownership is also something I think is really important if you dig into these trailblazers who have worked with NFTs to see the way that they've manipulated that. You can go into the next slide, John. So how in the past have we dealt with artworks that, like those other examples of internet art, play with tracing past footprints of the user, or have unusual ways that they change the sort of traditions of ownership? Well, in the variable media paradigm that's become one of the sort of benchmarks or frameworks used by today's art museums to think about work from performative art to conceptual art to installations with variable components to, of course, digital art, which changes dramatically based on the current file format and screen resolution and so forth. There are basically 4 strategies in this framework. Storage is the one we're most familiar with. Put it in a crate, forget about it. Works great for paintings, sucks for video art or anything with a computer. You're going to pull it out in 20 years and you're not going to be able to find a floppy drive, and you're not going to be able to plug it in even to the electricity sometimes. We're all familiar with the problems of storage. And so that's the sort of the knee-jerk reaction, but a rather poor one for variable media. Migration is probably more accepted among this group. Let's say I have a document that was originally in, I don't know, WordStar. I might have upgraded it to WordPerfect at one point, and then to Microsoft Word, and now maybe to Google Documents. So the notion is keep transferring it to the most up-to-date medium, hoping that you keep it alive and yet keep its salient characteristics functioning. Emulation's the new kid on the block, where you're an entire kind of computer or operating system is being impersonated, an old one impersonated by a newer computer. That's something very promising that John will speak about when it comes to emulating blockchains. And then reinterpretation is a sort of up and coming strategy familiar from theater and other performative venues, whereby there's a lot of artistic license taken in recreating a work. Let's go to the next slide. So let's say we took storage. How would we store a blockchain? And again, I'm assuming that the blockchain is vulnerable, as has happened in the past. And as you see the failure points that are out there, what if we wanted to keep the work that was on that blockchain functioning by storage? Well, the default would be sort of just let it expire and say what had expiration date, that's it. We wash our hands of it. None of the artists we talked to like that option for obvious reasons. Freezing it would be to say, well, every blockchain is a series of kind of snapshots in time interlinked by cryptographic hashes. And so we could just say, all right, well, let's stop at the last fully functioning one and leave it at that. Again, none of the artists we spoke to like that option because it takes away the whole dynamic of having a smart contract that users can interact with over time. Sustaining it, well, that was quite popular with the artists. That's the notion that a museum would grab the last fully functioning state of a blockchain and basically run the node themselves. And Regina alluded to that strategy. It's one that is possible, but it means that you're going to kind of assume or forecast that the Ethereum or Tezos or Bitcoin or whatever out in the world is going to die off. And as a museum or a constellation of museums, you have to create a network of nodes that are going to keep that going. And the artists love that idea because, hey, the museums are responsible. But is that realistic for museums to really do that? And what does it mean to sort of take a global sort of set of decentralized computers and sort of stick them in, I don't know, conservation warehouses across the world? It also means that there isn't a lot of option for change should, for example, the operating systems on which the blockchain depend change. Let's go to the next slide. So after storage, you got migration. And one of the artists suggested a novel way to handle a dying chain, which was to take, again, the last viable version and essentially offload it to what we call a paper wallet. And that means all of the transactions and all of the sort of essential data on blockchains is handled by cryptographic signatures. So you could take those keys and write them down essentially, and the IDs and so forth, the hashes. So you have, either a physical document or a spreadsheet or something with all of them in. And in theory, you could sort of add water and sort of reconstitute the chain in another system and or, for example, in a different cryptocurrency. So for example, if Ethereum died, maybe you could switch everything that was on there over to Tezos, which is another cryptocurrency used for NFT sales. Again, some of the artists thought this was popular. I think it's a lot of work. I'm not sure even how much compatibility there is between two different types of chains. So I'm a little suspicious about this option. Next slide. Finally, emulation, which again is one of the most promising strategies in any preservation, many preservation fields. What happens if we apply that to a dying blockchain? Well, there's still, even within emulation, three different options I could think of. One is to reset the chain, right? So it's as though, you've emulated, I don't know, Windows 95 on your Mac, and you start it up as though it was the first time you ever opened Windows 95, as opposed to keeping all the artifacts from, I don't know, an old computer. Well, nobody liked that because you're essentially wiping out the history of the blockchain. And again, that's often essential to the work. Forking the chain is a little different. Forking is where you sort of take the last state and you recreate a version in emulation that continues on even if the original state dies off. And this has happened before. The Ethereum blockchain was in danger because of essentially a bug in the system and the community. Most of them voted to change tracks over to the forked version of the chain. And finally, continuing would be to sort of take up from where the last chain left off. So these are some options that in general that emulation would offer us. John Bell is now going to talk us through exactly what would be required technically to make that happen.
Thanks. So I want to start out here just talking about exactly what it is that the artists are seeing when they are going and creating these works, because the way that people have been engaging with the underlying technologies, right? The idea that these artworks are meant to show off a particular aspect of the underlying blockchain would give you the suggestion that the artists are really engaging at a very deep technical level. To a certain extent, they are, but to a certain extent, they are part of the current sort of postmodern programming paradigm where you are really specialized in your one area that you are looking at, but you are dependent upon lots of other sort of externalities. So this is a screenshot from the documentation for Solidity, which is one of the development environments that's used to create these kinds of works. Once you accept these features as a given, you do not have to worry about the underlying technology, or do you have to know how Amazon's AWS works internally in order to use it? Well, you don't have to in order to use it, but you may need to in order to preserve it. So if we're going to talk about emulation, we need to go a little bit further down the rabbit hole than maybe some of the initial artists are really engaging with the technology at. I'm going to look at tokens equal text as a case study for that sort of breakdown. But one thing I want to say is that the transition that Regina mentioned to Ethereum 2.0, all of those steps that were in that earlier slide, this is going to have a pretty big impact on how all of this works. And there's going to be a lot of conceptual questions about how to preserve the older versions or whether to preserve the older versions, how to migrate works that are inherently mixing the technical and conceptual over to a new technical foundation, those kinds of things. But for right now, this is looking at if you wanted to take the existing Ethereum chain and a work on it, how would you actually emulate that? First, you have to break that down a little bit and say, okay, so what is actually a work? Well, on the left here, you've got the Ethereum chain, which you can think of as a data source of sorts. That includes the actual blockchain itself, as well as the Ethereum nodes that are running it, the EVMs. In the middle here, you have the artwork. I'm conceiving of the artwork for these purposes as the specific code that is running, drawing that data from the chain, doing something with it that will turn it into either a presentation or modifying the data that goes back to the chain in future transactions. Most of these artworks also have a component that is outside of the chain, as has been mentioned. In this case, I'm conceiving of this as the IPFS storage, and that is what tokens equal text uses for some of the assets it includes in the web display, the web application that was mentioned. And of course, you have the user. If you just have the underlying system emulated, you also need to have some sort of way of presenting it back to the user in a way that they will be able to look at in modern systems, even though they may be connecting to an emulated system. Breaking that down a little bit further, what do I mean by the blockchain? Well, the blockchain is, as I said, well, okay, in the current version of Ethereum, the blockchain is that entire history of transactions and tokens that has been discussed before. It's the Ethereum virtual machine. Those virtual machines can run on a number of different platforms. One of the more popular ones is Geth, so you would have to have the Go language as part of this system as well. Lots of other sort of dependencies get baked into that system. And the way that these are often distributed is as Docker containers. So Docker is a way of, you can think of it as a sort of lightweight virtual machine that's not entirely accurate, but it's close enough for our purposes right now. The idea of this distribution system is that you can take all of these different types of virtual machines and stack them on one actual machine. The way that this often works in practice is actually the underlying machine is also virtual in some way, but it's a different type of virtual machine. So it's onion skinning all the way down. The artwork itself is also a little bit more complicated than it might initially seem. So if you start to break this down, you have, in the case of tokens equal text, you have a web application, the DApp that Regina mentioned, that consists of the Apache server. It consists of the custom code that is being used to render the tokens to go out and access the Ethereum chain in order to get the token data that you're running off of, as well as the underlying web server that's built on. For the case of tokens equal text specifically, there are also external dependencies. So if you look at the web application itself, you've got a number of queries out to load jQuery, to load Google Fonts, to load images out of IPFS in some cases. All of those also need to be contained in some sort of emulation container if you're going to try to recreate this work in a protected environment. One thing I will say about IPFS is that's another case where it's meant to be a distributed file system, and you can create individual nodes based on Docker instances. So when you're trying to build this network, you also have to sort of spread it to other networks as well in order to capture the entire system. And then, of course, you have to have the actual Ethereum tokens themselves. The viewer component of this is in some ways the most straightforward because it's the way that users are engaging in any case. You have to have some sort of way of actually connecting the viewer to the network, having them load the distributed app. They're going to need access to the Ethereum token. They're going to need access to a wallet of some sort, showing MetaMask here. They're going to have a web browser that they use to load up the app. They're going to have underlying software, just the operating system. It's a good idea to keep all of these things together because imagine 10, 15 years down the road when we're on Windows 23, you might not have all of these pieces available in order to recreate the experience or the way that the piece was originally created. So from a pure emulation point of view, these are all things that you're going to stick on a shelf somewhere. What exactly you choose to stick on a virtual shelf really depends on how paranoid you want to be about it. I tend to be more paranoid, but if you start from just what you really need to keep track of, the tokens that you've purchased, obviously, then you want to start capturing the unique assets that might be part of the work. So it might be the source code for the artwork. It might be the external assets that are specific to the artwork that may be stored in other systems, like IPFS in this case. Then you want to start thinking about, okay, once I have the specific pieces of the work itself, what external dependencies, what external sort of standards do I need to pull in as well? jQuery or Google Fonts are a good example of those in this case. So that's all the data that you're working with. Now, how about the underlying software used to process and recreate that work? Firefox and MetaMask, in this case, are a good way to do that. And what are all of those clients going to connect to? Well, you need the servers and the sources for them to load up. So all of those Docker containers with IPFS or with an Ethereum virtual machine or the blockchain itself. And again, that last one, the blockchain itself, is going to be changing pretty significantly here in the near future. And if you're like me and you want to make sure that everything really works, you also need the actual underlying infrastructure of the operating systems themselves, because there's no guarantee that any of the things that are working on top of that are going to be compatible with future operating systems. So for full emulation, what do you need? Well, you need one virtual machine that acts as the sort of server instance, and that might have your Ethereum virtual machines. It might have your IPFS instance. You need another virtual machine that is the artwork itself. And then you're going to need clients and a way for all of those clients to connect back to the system that you've constructed. This leaves a number of potential open questions here. Some of them are conceptual and some of them are technical. So one is just, are transactions actually meaningfully emulatable? The is art piece that was mentioned a little bit earlier from Ria, that's a case where right now, if you were to ask for a transaction on the Ethereum chain, that's actually got a cost associated with it, a gas fee. If you were to recreate all of these pieces in a private network, then you may have a different form of gas fee, or you may eliminate that entirely. Is that really still the same transaction at that point if you're changing the parameters of the transaction? There could also be just technical problems taking a public blockchain private. This is one instance where I think the new changes to Ethereum are going to cause more, not necessarily problems, but more complications. So, for instance, there's discussion of having shards of blockchains in the future, and not all nodes will have copies of blockchains in the future. That is a complicating factor if you're trying to collect all of those things. When do you collect a copy? John mentioned this earlier. Do you collect it when you acquire a work? Do you collect it at the last time that the work is set to change, even though it may still change after that date? Those are all good questions, because you need to sort of play the field as far as knowing when a technology may fail, right? So one thing that I don't think that we can depend on is museum professionals to know that the Ethereum chain is about to break down, and so we need to save that last blockchain before it completely collapses. Can the payload data be migrated to new tokens? And this is potentially related to the paper wallet concept that John was mentioning before. But if we're treating the blockchain as data only, does that mean that we can take that data and move it elsewhere, or is it really fundamentally required to bring the chain with it? And will the emulation of time or context-based works reset the chain? How is it going to be managed? Those questions that John was mentioning before, again, get complicated by some of the new changes that are coming down the pike. So that's an overview for that particular work, the tokens equal text work. And I think we are now ready for questions.
Thank you, John. Also Regina and John. I know my head's swimming in questions. I saw a really great discussion in the chat. I don't know if this looks like Fabiana, Tracy, John, and Regina, you were talking a little bit. I don't know if you wanted to expand on that any further. This is about the complexities and challenges, especially if you think about live performance arts and the similarities there, and kind of the preferences of the creator.
Well, and I just, you know, my head is swimming as well. I mean, it was just had me thinking about like what is the responsibility of cultural heritage institutions when artists are working in such ephemeral and complex media? It really and I mean I also have to admit I didn't have any idea that museums were working. I mean, just thought of these NFTs as being a private, collectors, and didn't realize that museums were already working in this space. And it makes me wonder, like, how do I, as a museum goer, experience these pieces? Am I in the museum? Am I on the museum's website? Like, how does all of that work?
I will say quickly that I was just with a major media curator this past week. I can't say the museum, but there are major museums right now that are not so publicly like announcing it, but collecting swaths of works that have an NFT related to them. And at least from the one curator I spoke with, they will be displaying them essentially the same as any time-based media work. I don't think they're necessarily interested in flaunting the non-fungible token portion, but it depends on the work. But yes, it's happening globally right now.
I just want to come in and say that my comment about the fleeting nature of them is interesting, because some artists might be reluctant to I suppose, to preserve them. But if we, I think that is what Regina is doing, for example, conversing and talking and advocating for that is very good, because artists change their minds. And also, okay, the experience of watching a live performance, it can't, perhaps a preservation thing cannot replace that, but then how this artist and his creations or her creations will be represented in the history of these, in the bigger when NFTs or this type of art become a thing, a thing of being studied and to be. It's like digital preservation 20 years ago. People were not talking about. Now it is a subject. That is a body of things that needs to be discussed. Yeah. So I just want to say, remind me of live arts, because that is this thing there will be artists that are reluctant, but at the same time, that's why that advocacy of preserving them, it needs to happen. And I'm with you, Tracy. I didn't even know there are museums out there. I've learned a lot of things about NFTs today, so that's why I'm here. Thank you.
I have a question. I'm sure I'm confused. I'm thinking about the purpose of NFT, why it exists. Seems to be some sort of guarantee in terms of the authenticity of the artwork, which makes me think that now our trust seems to be in custodians, like in authoritative institutions, museums, archives, governments seem to have been replaced in our trust with technology. Can we just bypass NFT? End of the day, it's pointing to a piece of artwork. Can we still bank on the authoritativeness of the long-standing custodians and go directly to the artwork itself, bypass the NFT? And is that too naive to think that way?
So I'll take this one too really quick, because it comes up with conversations with artists and with museums that I'm consulting on this topic, and it really depends. And the reason I brought up the Rhea Myers and Kevin and Jennifer McCoy works is because their works that I know the artist does not want to separate, because they consider this smart contract to be an actual component of the artwork. So it's the same as, scraping off pigment on a canvas, in that case. So I not sure how true this exact statistic is, but there's another group that said 10% of works getting minted onto the blockchain right now have some component that it considers the smart contract as an aspect of the artwork. But to your point, one of the museums I'm consulting has asked the artists, like, do they, for that are more like receipts, if they need to collect the NFT or not. And in most cases, they're not, because they don't need to. We are bypassing it. So it depends.
Okay, thank you. Yep.
I've got a question. I think you kind of touched on this a little bit during your presentation, but just thinking about, how should the preservation challenges influence the creative process? You know, should preservationists be working with the creators during the creation? You know, sometimes they suggest that for traditional digital archival documents that, you know, we should be working with the content producers so they're not producing things in hard to capture formats. But, you know, they're not working often with creative documents. In that case, it's more business documents. So what relationship should preservationists have with the creators?
I do want to take this really quick, and then I want to hear John's perspectives because they might be different than mine. But I think if as a conservator or an archivist, your job is to deal with those problems. The artist's intent to me comes first. Like, we're the ones who are supposed to have the headache and be the problem solvers, right? At the same time, I think there has been this history of not giving artists the tool set to understand the value of thinking about preservation. So I tend to approach it as educating artists on what's out there and how they could be thinking about what materials they should be choosing. When I say materials, in this case, I mean digital materials. But if they choose to rebel against that in any way, sometimes that's what makes the work the most interesting. So.
Yeah, I would largely agree with that. I think that the key from my perspective is intervening, and I don't necessarily mean in a change sort of way, but intervening fairly early on in the process, because many of the steps that are required to create some of these artworks have their own ephemera that are attached to them that you may also need to capture later on that the artists aren't even thinking of yet. So trying to work with them through the process is an ideal state. I will say, though, that I don't know how realistic that is on a sort of repeatable basis, especially for a lot of these works that are intentionally engaging with sort of decentralized ways of dealing with art, and they may not want to think of authoritative people in that sense.
I would also argue that the condition is different for artists versus, say, government employees or data scientists and so forth. We'd really be talking out of both sides of our mouth if we went to artists and said, hey, you know, you must use this W3 standard tag, or I'm sorry, but you have to save this as PDF. Because at the same time, we're telling a contemporary artist that our textbooks and our, you know, lectures are all saying, like, look at this amazing guy who dripped paint on a canvas, and now he's like the best abstract expressionist. And oh, look, Namjoon Paik put a magnet on top of a TV and totally screwed it up. Isn't that awesome? Like, that would be really pretty hypocritical if we told artists both something different than we do in our practice curatorially.
But I will add to that, there are a lot of artists right now that are uploading, say, JPEGs, that if they knew that it was a lossy, compressed file, they didn't know that, they wouldn't have chosen a JPEG. So that's why the toolkit's important, but not like telling them they have to, you know, export a TIFF or a PNG, you know.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat, so I guess I'll ask another one. And this one is partly from my unfamiliarity with creative works and in general. Certainly no creative master myself, and not a copyright expert or anything like that, but just thinking about it from the public point of view. Should an artist have complete control over their creative work, especially like things that go viral, for instance, becomes a really big deal, lots of community involvement. Is there some ownership that the community has in any sort of way in some of those decisions about whether or not this work should be preserved or how it's described? Is the controversy around some of the stuff itself a work deserving of preservation? Those are probably some.
I'll just weigh in, but I think so one of the instruments that I mentioned, this variable media questionnaire, used to just ask the artist, like, hey, what do you want to have with this work? You know, is it okay for it to be migrated? Is it okay for it to change its dimension, size, or resolution, and so forth? And then basically in discussions with all kinds of different stakeholders, we realized there's a sort of public use of a work. And that means that it has influence beyond what the creator might have imagined. And so now we document what anybody thinks the work should be like. And then it's up to individual curators and conservators to make judgments based on more than just the artist's opinion. And as someone mentioned, the artist's opinion changes periodically. And so there can be successive sort of interviews over time. And often older artists have a very different perspective than young artists do. I think that might relate, though, to the first topic of game taxonomies. And I thought John Bell might have, or Mark might have some thoughts about that.
I mean, on my end, I think that the parallels here are that there are a lot of community constructions that go into what the artwork actually is. And particularly in this case, where you're talking about more sort of blockchain-based works that incorporate concepts like transaction into them at a fundamental level. Can you even say it's the artwork if you don't have those community interactions that are available? I would personally expand that a little bit, because I try to take a very broad view and try to capture different types of interactions, different types of impressions, just to understand the broader context that the artwork is being perceived in. And that goes back to some of the surveys that John and Regina have been talking about. It goes back to how different sort of interpretive communities. So for instance, if we're trying to preserve some of the NFT-based artworks that have been very often discussed in the press and gotten a lot of notoriety around them, you may not have any concept of what that artwork is if all you see in the future is just a JPEG of a monkey with a cigar or something, right? So trying to better capture that community response is also part of this larger network, I think.
I guess the last thing I'll say, because I completely agree with both John and John said, is that, we use the term in conservation, at least, artist as primary source, which means there are other sources.
And
We
Mark,
do
I didn't know
have.
if you-
Oh, go ahead.
Tracy.
We do have some questions from room 3 in the chat. So what
writing out the answer to one of them. Go ahead.
Oh, so what resources will also be available for those of us expected to collect NFTs? Asking from iPres in Glasgow as a digital preservation manager in an arts school that collects graduate works.
My short version, and Regina probably knows more than I, is that there's actually really easy to use technical infrastructure already in place and economic infrastructure to collect an NFT. Anyone can do it by spending a few $100s and getting a wallet and so forth. And it's, we can share tutorials on how to do that. I think the question addressed by this panel is, what if that blockchain fails? And, marketplaces and other pieces, major, continents or cities on in this blockchain bubble have sort of sunk in the last few months with the crypto winter arriving. And that means that some of those platforms might not be around when you go back to check on your NFT. So to understand the underlying technology is important. And to think about, like, what if the entire blockchain fails? Well, that's kind of the point of our panel. I don't think we have that technology in place or those protocols in place now. But, as I think it was Tracy mentioned, we may be seeing this as a completely bizarre and outlandish artistic experiment. But 20 years ago, we were saying the same thing about artist-made websites and things that were online. And now there are protocols and technologies that can help with us, but only because some people started to think about that 20 years ago.
And there's a follow-up question, and John, I don't know if I think you've seen the question. If your response included this, so returning to the variable media questionnaire, are collecting institutions undertaking artists' interviews?
Yes, most museums that I'm familiar with and collecting institutions in general in the Cultural Heritage Center, well, at least in the arts, are really starting to do interviews when they purchase something or commission something or acquire it. And that's super important, because that's when you have the artist over a fire. You can hold their feet to the fire and say, hey, you need to tell me the documentation. You need to tell me what you were thinking when you made this piece so that we can preserve it in the future. So I'm not a big I mean, it's great if artists let you into their studio, but who knows who's doing what and what you're going to collect in the future. So it's more like when a work is about to be acquired, then you really have that chance to kind of get all the data you need from them. However, I would also say that most of the tools are always a little bit behind. Like I said, I think this panel is kind of pretty forward-looking, and the variable media questionnaire, for example, does not currently have questions specific to the blockchain. But one of the things that I've been really lucky to work with Regina and John about is that we started to think what those questions would be, and we've come up with a series of them. And the notion of media independent behaviors means you think outside of the technology, and instead you think, what's the behavior required? What's the kind of action or dynamic that the art has to fulfill? And so in this case, as an example, the ability to record traces of an artwork that doesn't depend on the blockchain. There are artworks that do that don't have blockchain, and the ability to change or work with as a medium the ownership of an artwork. And again, we've seen how the blockchain, or not in much detail, but there are examples of NFT works where that's really important, how the work changes, and it's all handled via Ethereum, for example. So for example, one work can be owned by multiple people in a fractioned NFT, or conversely, two different owners may merge their NFT into one. And that kind of ownership seems very inventive, but there are artists who've worked with that in the past. Solowit created $100 so-called democratic drawings back in I think it was the 70s, where they always had to be sold for $100, and other artists have played with ownership. So again, those questions are, sort of being developed right now, but our goal is to look over the horizon and kind of figure out what we need to add to these instruments so that they'll still be useful, even with cutting edge stuff like blockchain.
And in terms of access, any of these major museums at this point that collect media art, upon acquisition, are doing technical artist questionnaires. So I would just get in contact with somebody at the institution if you're a researcher, and they should give you access the same way they would to any acquisition files.
So just to follow up on that question, it sounds like the person who's asking the question was interested in knowing if those questionnaires will be preserved long term. It sounds like what you're saying is they probably would be as part of the acquisition file.
That's right. They are part of the acquisition file.
I will just add, though, in my experience, getting access to those is not always guaranteed. So be aware that many institutions will be happy to work with you. Others are much more protective. And in most cases, I think it's less the institution than the original artist who may say things in private about the preservation of the work that they don't necessarily want to expose to researchers.
Which I just have to say is a terrible idea. I mean, you can have a certain private conversation separate from the public data, but as an example, the variable media questionnaire, we often work with established artists, and they've almost, with very few exceptions, said, yes, share our work publicly with everyone. There was one institution that did a group project with about, half dozen artists, and they wanted to keep it private. And then the institution went under and everything disappeared, and no one has the login, and no one can have access to all the interviews that were done for that project. So that sucks. Don't do that if you have the choice.
Well, we're coming up on the end of our session. We got about 5 minutes left if there's any further questions. Mark, I didn't know if you wanted to, if you had any thoughts on kind of how this all interplays with your work in taxonomies and video game development, if you see any parallels.
I admit that the blockchain is not my domain.
Anyone's welcome to ask even vocabulary questions. I know we use some technical words that are probably novel to most of you.
Should also maybe put our Twitter handles in the chat so that you can follow up there. I want to say one thing that I think is a little bit related to what Mark was doing. Someone, maybe Brent, someone mentioned performance. And I actually think performance is a really good lens to look at digital artwork through. As an example, one of the earliest works of internet art, or an early sort of genre of internet art, took advantage of a bug in Netscape 1. So the earliest browser that was kind of popular and popularized the World Wide Web, you could add multiple body tags, which you're not supposed to do, and it would read one and render it, and then it would read the next one and render that, and then read the next one. And as a result, you could create weird kind of animations. This was long before JavaScript or Flash or Director. Netscape 1.1 came out and fixed the bug, and then all this artwork died in a span of 11 months. Like that was the period of history in which that artwork genre was viable. But numerous artists, including some that are well known today, took advantage of that and experiment and glitch. And so if you think of that as a static work, what do? There's absolutely no way to sort of show a piece based on a glitch with an obsolete browser. But if you think of it as a sort of score that can be reperformed, well, then you could take an emulator and you could run an obsolete browser, and you could even throttle the bandwidth so that it simulates the kind of gradual arrival of these HTML tags and painting to the screen. So thinking from a lens of performance often gives us tools that we wouldn't have if we thought of pinning a butterfly to the wall.
And the use of the term performative behavior was no mistake. And I agree that all time-based media artwork is meant to be thought about performatively. And two of my examples, Mad Dog Jones and Kevin and Jennifer McCoy's work, they only exist over a finite period. The first being a year, right? It stops performing after a year technically, and then Kevin and Jennifer's being for 3 years, but that they're supposed to have this history of those performances preserved in some way on the blockchain. But yeah, but we've definitely asked them both, what do you think about re-performance of this in terms of emulation? Is it just watching the tokens generate over X amount of time again, or is it just once?
All right. Thank
Well,
you all
this has
so
been
much. Yeah,
fascinating.
very much.
Thanks for having us.
I wanted to invite everybody to turn on their cameras, and we'll just do a real quick virtual round of applause for our presenters. And I also wanted to thank my co-chairs and everyone for coming out today. Next up, for those in Glasgow, you'll have the welcome reception, and for those of us online, the late show begins in, I believe, an hour. So thank you everyone for coming out.
Thank you, Brent. Thanks everybody.
Great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.